Hello fans of history, and welcome to History Rocks. Today we're going to take a look at the social effects of World War I on America. And you can see that right here with this first picture of the fact that we have a bunch of ladies entering into the workforce and one lucky man who's left behind. So that lucky man either had his flat feet, diabetes, and asthma that prevented him from making it into the draft, or for whatever reason he's left behind. But now we've got all these women that are entering into major work positions. So the fact is that many women are going to serve in World War I as some form of factory laborer, or as a nurse, or as a paramilitary group. Now, we'll start with factory laborers. I mean, women working in factories is nothing incredibly new to American history, but the fact that over 1 million women who are not typically working class women, many of them married women, many of them middle class women, are going to enter into the workforce. And that's what makes it new and kind of exciting too, because now women are earning money outside of the home, working jobs. That is going to lead to some social changes that we'll see happening in the 1920s. Many women, of course, working also as nurses for the Red Cross, handing out donuts and coffee, maybe serving in a field hospital over in Europe somewhere. Some women will serve even as a paramilitary group, such as the Lafayette Escadrille, which were a bunch of ladies who decided to go over to Europe to serve as a paramilitary group where they wear their uniforms, they try to boost morale. They don't actually fight. They were never used for fighting, but they are there to boost morale amongst the menfolk, and it will be very effective. But the fact is that World War I started to expose many of the social issues that were already a burning question in America before the war, and it's going to exacerbate some of those social problems. One example of that is the effects that it'll have upon African Americans. So the African American population in the South, obviously living under Jim Crow, having a lot of problems at this time, but once the war begins, it's going to lead to a problem in which we need more people in the workforce, more factory laborers, both women and males. And so companies are going to appeal to African Americans to move to the North, the land of milk and honey, to come and get jobs in major urban centers across the North. Now, this is a thing called the Great Migration, in which over 1 million African Americans and their families are going to leave from the South to go to the North, hoping for greater opportunity, hoping for jobs. They'll play an important role in the factories, but at the same time, it also leads to some problems in the North, because I think many people live under the fatuous assumption that the North did not have racial tension, that the North was not racist, that it did not have Jim Crowism, that it did not have elements of the KKK or problems socially due to racial issues. And that's not true. In some cities like Detroit or Chicago or Minneapolis that didn't have a whole lot of African Americans initially, now they're going to see a tripling of the black population in those cities, and many of those African Americans are working for jobs and competing for jobs in the same areas that whites are, and often getting paid similar wages. That's going to lead to a lot of controversy. We're going to see a little time period known as the Red Summer, where over the course of the summer of 1919 into 1920, there will be 25 different race riots across the United States. Now, it'll begin in Chicago, but one of the worst ones will happen in East St. Louis, where a defense industry plant had both whites and blacks working together. There was competition, there was some disagreements. It led to a brawl outside the factory that then spilled over into the ghetto neighborhood where many African Americans lived, and the whites went rampaging through the neighborhood, killing, lynching, burning. In fact, there was a 90-year-old man that was drug off his porch, and then he was lynched publicly from a lamppost. There were 40 blacks that were killed, 9 whites that were killed in the ensuing violence. So again, World War I brought about a lot of social tension in America. While it was already there to begin with, it only exposed those problems because of the effects of war. Now, another problem that we'll have in the United States at this time is with the effects of civil liberties. And anytime the United States enters into a form of war, we often have infringements upon civil liberties due to dangers that are supposed to be out there or thought to be out there, often are out there. So it really depends upon your perspective here with civil liberties and whether or not they're being infringed upon or not. We definitely saw some problems happening where there were a lot of campaigns for Americanism and different witch hunts going on for people that were deemed un-American. So, for instance, symphonies around the United States were banned from playing Bach or Beethoven because, of course, they are German. They also were no longer calling things by the same names. They called sauerkraut Liberty cabbage. They called hamburgers, which are from Hamburg, Germany, they called them Liberty steaks. They transformed the names of dachshunds and German shepherds to Liberty pups, and then went so far as to say that German measles, a deadly disease, is actually going to be renamed Liberty measles. Yes, very nice. So this kind of thing will lead to some problems, though, where people are getting arrested if they are not showing enough support for the United States, particularly if they are German immigrants, first or second generation German immigrants. Another problem that we'll see is German teachers are going to be forced to take their German textbooks, German language books, and burn them publicly. There will even be murders of townspeople who were not seen as patriotic enough, and the juries that will gather to prosecute the crime of this murder will say that it was a patriotic murder done in the interest of the United States. A lot of that kind of thing going on at this time, and certainly exposing some problems. Good example of that, too, not just dealing with Germans, is with the Irish. The Irish were not big fans of the fact that the United States joined in a war with Great Britain, who was denying the Irish their home rule at this point because the war kind of got in the way and a lot of other political issues. So the Irish mine workers in Butte, Montana, there were a lot of them, they're going to decide to go on strike and then blow up a mine building. Well, this brought out the National Guard. It also brought about the change in the laws where the state of Montana created an Espionage and Sedition Act so that they could take care of anyone who's a spy or is seditious against their country and then put them into jail. Well, the federal government liked it so much that they put in their own Espionage and Sedition Act, modeling it off of Montana's law, but also modeling it after the Alien and Sedition Acts that were around during the XYZ affair, during President Adams' term of office around the turn of the century in 1800. And the Espionage and Sedition Acts are an updated law making it so that if you speak out against your government or against its leaders, like the president, or against its war policy, you will receive imprisonment up to 5 years and fines up to $20,000. Now, this kind of thing super goes against President Wilson's claim that we were fighting for democracy, that we were fighting for self-determination, fighting for political liberty. Totally hypocritical given the fact that opposition, freedom of speech and freedom of opposition are guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, but apparently not during wartime. And there will be over 1,000 convictions, especially of socialists, because socialists were opposed to the war in the first place, claiming it was a war for imperialism. One of those famous socialists who will be targeted was Eugene V. Debs, who is a prominent progressive reformer, a union organizer, and who had seen a lot of success at the end of the 19th century, and he'd run for president, I think, 3 times at this point. He's going to run for president again, though, in 1916 against President Wilson, and he'll end up getting thrown in jail because he spoke out against the policies of the president. And so when he is in jail, he'll still run for president, though. And while running for president, he's going to end up getting more votes. He'll get 1 million votes, more votes than any other socialist candidate up to this point, and he'll do it while in jail. Now later he's going to try to appeal to the Supreme Court, and they're going to deny him, saying that he's still guilty and he will have to serve out his prison sentence. But the message was out that infringements upon civil liberties certainly are a thing during wartime. Now, another thing that we see happening at this time is a lot of xenophobia during the first Red Scare. Red Scare, in this case, not referring to blood. The Red Summer that we just talked about a minute ago was referring to blood in the streets. The Red Scare in this case is referring to red of communism. So there's a lot of fear of those anarchist terrorists, fear of Bolshevik terrorists. And if you think about it from today's perspective, how many Americans are justifiably very fearful of Islamic fundamentalism and jihadism. I mean, those are the kinds of terrorists that Americans are afraid of today, but anarchism brought about World War I. I mean, the anarchists of the Black Hand and Gavrilo Princip, who was a part of that group, killed the Archduke. That facilitated the start of World War I. Also, the Bolshevik Revolution that took place in Russia overthrew the Tsarist regime, and so there is a lot of fear of international terrorism coming to the United States. And so fear of foreigners is nothing new. Xenophobia, after all, is a Chinese word that we're going to use here in America now because fearful of outside influence, and that's been around in American history for a long time. But it's going to lead to a bunch of anti-Bolshevik witch hunts called the Palmer Raids. It all has to do with A. Mitchell Palmer, who one evening was headed downstairs when he heard the door knock, and someone had left a briefcase on his doorstep. As he approached to his door to retrieve, or to open it to see who had been knocking, the bomb exploded prematurely, knocking A. Mitchell Palmer across the living room, blowing off the door, blowing out the windows of his living room, scaring the heck out of him too, and justifiably he's pretty upset. Does he know who left it? No. Does he assume it's the Bolsheviks? Yes. All right, there's a lot of reasons maybe to believe that, but the fact is that it's just going to be kind of a nice, easy way to find a scapegoat. So what he'll do is with the newly created Federal Bureau of Investigation, he's going to head a bunch of raids that will try to take out Bolsheviks and deport them. Now, he'll end up losing favor with the government and get kicked out of office by 1921, but at that point, the 27-year-old J. Edgar Hoover is going to take over as the youngest head of the FBI, and he will remain as the head of the FBI until the early 70s upon his death. So love him or hate him, J. Edgar Hoover is an interesting character who's going to do a lot of good things and also weird things for America. Good things. If you have a driver's license today, if you have an international passport, if you have a social security number, if you are familiar with fingerprinting or ballistics technology, these are all things that were brought in under J. Edgar Hoover's either ideas or under his leadership with the FBI. This is a guy that came up with our modern efforts and modern techniques of tracking down criminal activity, and dang it, he's good at his job. You know what he is also good at? Is digging up dirt on everyone. So throughout his tenure as the head of the FBI, he's going to end up having files on just about every famous figure in American history. He had one on Charlie Chaplin. He had one on Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in the 20s. He had one on black nationalists such as Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. Skip ahead to the 60s. He had dirt on Martin Luther King Jr., on Malcolm X, on JFK, Bobby, you name it, he had dirt on everyone. And he used that dirt in order to blackmail those figures of American history to get what he wanted. Frequently blackmailing our president. Now, J. Edgar Hoover had his own dirt, though. There's a lot of evidence to indicate that he was actually a crossdresser, that he was in love with his mama to some extent, that he might have even been buried in his mother's dress. There's also a lot of evidence to indicate that while he was married, he was also in love with his second in command, who was a dude in the FBI. And so there's, certainly evidence to indicate that while he might be digging up dirt on everyone else, he had plenty of his own. Of course, that evidence always disappears when he wants it to. So J. Edgar Hoover is an interesting character, but he's going to end up using torture, which is, against the Constitution, wiretapping without, enough constitutional authority to do it, and the use of spies and informants to find possible Bolsheviks, root them out of American society, and deport them back to Russia.
The first act, in many ways the strangest and most terrifying of the entire decade, began in the spring of 1919, before the troops had even finished coming home. On the evening of May 1st, a night clerk at the main branch of the U.S. Post Office on 33rd Street and 8th Avenue happened to notice 16 slender, identically wrapped packages, each addressed to a prominent politician or businessman, and each containing enough nitroglycerin to blow a man's head off. Confirming deeply rooted American fears that sinister foreign elements were at work in the land, revelation helped set in motion the Red Scare, a wave of political reaction and xenophobia unlike anything seen in the country before or since, directed at cities with large populations of immigrants, and especially New York. Within months, groups that had enjoyed triumphant success only a few years before, immigrant workers, progressive reformers, and union organizers, found themselves on the run.
And there are mass roundups. People are taken out, put on Ellis Island, and if they're aliens, they are slated for deportation. and of course the most famous deportee who was sent off in this period is Emma Goldman. And it's like a fever that grips people. There's another wave in early 1920, and then it breaks. It was like the fever had broken. And it's, I think, then that we really move into the 20s, and we've moved into a new climate. The communists are going to be driven underground. The labor movement is still there, but it's in serious disarray. You created a space where both globally, in terms of the competitors in Europe or basket cases, business in the United States and in New York in particular is looking at fabulous possibilities for normalcy, for profit making, for getting on with business.
So as you heard, there were a lot of different things happening in America at this time that created a lot of xenophobia coming in waves. And so there were a lot of people fearful because of the war. It'll dissipate for a while, but we'll see another Red Scare in the 1950s. There's certainly different scares dealing with immigrant populations to America at this time. And still today we're debating on whether or not immigration restrictions should be put up with things like building the wall with Mexico. So this is something that's happened throughout United States history and often deals with the problems that we see exposed socially or politically. So some questions to consider though with the first Red Scare. Was it justified to be xenophobic? Yeah. I mean, there was terrorism, certainly. There were conflicts around the globe. We're in the middle of trying to end this war, and there's a lot of resistance and backlash and weird things happening in America, a lot of changes happening in America that many people did not want to see. And so immigration restrictions might have made sense. Should the government be allowed to infringe upon civil liberties when it deems it necessary? It will do it time and again. They did it in the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. They did it in the Civil War when Lincoln infringed upon habeas corpus and other constitutional rights. They'll do it here. They'll do it again throughout the 20th century during wartime in World War II, Vietnam, and certainly with the Patriot Act as well. So I'm going to leave it open for the comments section to see if you believe that the federal government should be allowed to infringe on civil liberties. But for now, let's move on. Now, I'd love to move on. But the fact is that I'm just not feeling well. I've got coughing, I've got chills, fever, body aches, been vomiting, dizzy, labored breathing, even having nosebleeds and profuse sweating. Anyone know what I've got? Spanish influenza. That's right. So Spanish influenza started in Fort Riley, Kansas. Not Spain. Not Spain. It started in Fort Riley, Kansas. The reason they called it the Spanish flu was because that's where they first saw the mass amount of deaths. By 1918 and 1919, there had been 8 million deaths in Spain, and it was all brought over there by American soldiers. Those American soldiers were in Fort Riley, Kansas, training for the war in March of 1918, and they had this problem where they had a little bit too much horse poop. So with this little bit too much horse poop, they decided to pile it into a giant pile and then set it on fire. And while that horse poop is flaming, it's casting the smoke of that loveliness into the air, and the men who are training to be soldiers are running around, sucking it into their lungs. Pretty soon, men will start to line up at the infirmary. Pretty soon, hundreds will be in the infirmary. And then those that don't get sick and die will end up becoming carriers of this illness and will take it with them as they meet Red Cross nurses, who will then become in contact with it and then spread it to every soldier they meet. They will then take it with them to the trenches of Europe, and it will become a pandemic, meaning a global phenomena, a global disease. So this pandemic is going to become the most deadly disease in world history because of the shortness of the duration of its time. All right, no disease, plague, war, or famine, or natural catastrophe in world history has ever killed so many people in such a short amount of time. For instance, in America, there will be 25% of the population that will get infected with the flu, and 675,000 of them will end up dying. Cities like St. Louis and Chicago will actually run out of enough coffins. They'll start importing coffins like crazy from around the United States to try and have them in reserve. And then kids will play on the mountains of coffins that are sitting there next to the railroad station. They'll even come up with some fun songs. There was a great song from the Black Death era, which went like this: "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down." It's a song about dancing over the grave of Rosie and their pocket full of posies that they brought for the deceased little child. Another fun song that's new to 1918, though, was made up by children, where they said, "I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza. Yeah! Well, Europeans, especially the Germans, wondered if the Americans brought over the influenza as a form of biological warfare. And so this is going to end up becoming a nasty little disease, and one of the first of the 20th century to start killing off people as a pandemic. So what we're seeing here at this point is many theaters, many schools, all kinds of places will be closed down, people wearing masks all the time, because for the first time in our history in America, we're seeing the effects of a massive, very deadly disease. And that happens to be the way that we end World War I, a war that killed 13 million people from deaths in battle, and then another 30 to 50 million people killed as the result of infectious disease and a pandemic of catastrophic size. Thanks for watching.